Hello, I'm Reuben Moss, Vice President and Curator of the Hagerstown Frederick Railway Historical Society. Our organization was founded in 1999 to preserve and promote the history and heritage of the electric railroad that connected Hagerstown, Frederick, and about 24 communities through Frederick and Washington County. Today, 4 trolleys and about a dozen structures survive. Our organization focuses instead on the small artifacts, documents, and photographs that still exist of this line so that we can provide historical information to those doing restoration and to the public. 65 years ago, this past Wednesday, February 20th, 1954, the last trolley departed Frederick for Thurmont on a round trip. To the uninitiated with the Hagerstown and Frederick, the thought of a trolley in the streets of Frederick may bring up an image something like this: a more traditional streetcar coach in the middle of a rather empty street. This is actually in Williamsport. Or perhaps you think something a little bit smaller like this city car near Patrick Street on Market Street in Frederick in the 1920s. Or, if your image of trolleys comes from watching Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood or something of the like, you might picture something like this: an open car, seen here in Washington Street in Hagerstown, but similar cars did operate in Frederick. These images, however, do not really tell the story of what the Hagerstown and Frederick really was. This system was an interurban network, which means that instead of focusing on a city and maybe a few of its suburbs, this line connected multiple urban centers, like a larger railroad would on a larger scale. This line operated slightly larger trolleys on slightly faster trips, but while city cars tended to go 5-10 miles per hour, these still only went about 20-25. In their atlas-like and very extensive history of interurbans in America, George Hilton and John Dew wrote in 1960, one of the most extensive interurban systems in the Middle Atlantic states was the Hagerstown and Frederick, which operated at, here they say 76 miles. It's actually 87.5 miles of line in central Maryland. These were not high-speed lines, and typically single light cars units were operated. But important freight business developed, and the line was to earn the distinction of being the last passenger-carrying interurban east of the Chicago area, on a route that by all logic should have abandoned service 2 or 3 decades earlier. Later in their book, they go on to say that the Hagerstown line crossed the Blue Ridge Mountains on very steep grades to provide one of the most scenic interurban rides in the country. Now, calling this line scenic and steep is not an exaggeration. Climbing both South Mountain and Catoctin Mountain and dipping into a valley between Middletown and Myersville, the line offered grades up to and over 8%, more than most railroads would even ever consider. You can see one such grade here near the top of Catoctin Mountain, as Car 11, one of Frederick and Middletown Railway's earliest cars, climbs towards Braddock Heights from Frederick. A little bit further up the hill, Car 166 is descending towards Frederick with Braddock Heights Amusement Park in the background. And if you cross the Catoctin, Car 170 is descending towards Middletown near the top of the mountain with a spectacular view of the Middletown Valley, unobstructed by the trees that now block this view for the most part today. The road in the foreground, by the way, is alternate 40. Speaking of trees, very few people may realize that there were very few trees at the top of Catoctin Mountain when the trolleys were first built. A lot of this land had been used as farmland, and when the trolleys came, it was divvied out into parcels and the houses began to appear. This attracted more riders to the trolley, as the top of the mountain was rather breezy. Even between Frederick and Thurmont, where the trolley had to only contend with small rolling hills, there were scenic views over farmland and ponds, with a few wooded sections in between. And this may be one of the reasons why many groups, like this ERA special, the Electric Railroaders Association, would come to this area to ride the trolleys. For about $20, they could charter a trolley, make their own schedule, and spend the whole day riding around the line. These groups were offered the opportunity to climb off the trolley at various points, and, like we see here at Rudy's Hollow between Middletown and Myersville, photograph and videotape the trolleys going by. This has become a source for many of the historic photographs that are in our collection, offering a glimpse of how the line operated, what it looked like, and how the different trolleys changed over the years. Now, in one of my talks, I take about an hour to go step by step over the entire line, talking about how each section was built, where it traveled, and what it looked like. But because I've got so much to talk about today, I'll simply say that from Frederick, the line climbed Catoctin Mountain at Braddock Heights, and then descended towards Middletown. In 1905, a branch went from Braddock Heights to Jefferson, and from the earliest days, there was a line starting as a steam railroad from Frederick north to Yellow Springs, Lewistown, Bethel, Catoctin, Furnace, and Thurmont. From Middletown, the main line continued to Myersville, then over South Mountain to Mount Lena. Boonesboro Junction, there was a branch to Mapleville and Boonesboro, before the main line continued to Beaver Creek, Funkstown, and then Hagerstown, where there was another branch that went to Halfway and Williamsport, and a northern branch heading to Paramount, Reed, and then Shady Grove, Pennsylvania, where the line connected to the Chambersburg, Greencastle, and Waynesboro Electric Railway. To simplify it, the corporate history of the H&F is very complex, since the system was built piecemeal by a number of companies, which were consolidated into the Hagerstown and Frederick in 1913. There were two basic parts, one centering on Hagerstown, one on Frederick. Now each part, the Hagerstown and the Frederick parts, had their own city service, which I'll briefly touch on in a little while. But for most of the lines and the most memorable sections of the route, communities were served by the interurbans, or more specifically, in most cases, an interurban combine. Now this is a traditional Hagerstown and Frederick interurban combine. Car 167 was purchased in 1914, and it's called a combine because it has both a passenger combined with a baggage compartment. This style was very common, beginning with early cars in 1902, continuing through 1909, as we see here with car 160, which was originally Hagerstown Railway car 45. Similar cars were operated in Frederick. And continued through 1921, when this car, 172, was purchased as the last brand new trolley purchased from the J.G. Brill Company in Philadelphia. Newer cars of the coach style were acquired over the years, but those were the last brand new cars. Hagerstown and Frederick rarely operated cars connected like these seen between Chicago and Milwaukee, and they were not this fast. They also weren't simple coaches like these cars seen in Reading that served in the city streets, or this older coach seen in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. And when many of the companies began to upgrade in the 1930s to these President's Committee car or PCC cars to compete with the modern buses, the Hagerstown and Frederick never upgraded. Instead, they stuck with the cars that they had begun with in the early 1900s. This may also be one reason why so many people came to ride the Hagerstown and Frederick over the years. Even in the 1940s and 1950s, the company operated very much the way it had in the 19-teens and 1920s, and the cars rarely looked any different. On both ends of the car, there were controls in the vestibule. This allowed the operator to take his control handles to the other end of the car, change the direction of the pole on the roof, and go the opposite way. That eliminated the need for a loop at the end of each line like big cities tended to have. Taking up 2/3 to 3/4 of the car was a passenger compartment with seats covered in a material called rattan. It's a type of lacquered wicker. These seats had backs that could be switched one way or the other so that passengers were always facing forward or could be facing friends. Advertising tended to run along the top of the windows, as was common trolley practice, and many of the windows could lift up into the ceiling, giving the feeling of an open-air car. The opposite end of the car was a baggage compartment, which also offered benches, could be used as a smoking area, as well as the baggage and freight area, and our ERA friends here show it was a nice airy compartment for private charters. This compartment saw the most use on the Thurmont branch, where every Western Maryland passenger train heading between Baltimore and Cumberland was met by a trolley. While passengers were exchanging between the trolley or the train, so was their baggage, along with official U.S. mail, express parcels, and any other shipments that were being transported that didn't need an entire boxcar or freight car. It wasn't uncommon for these baggage areas to become overflowed, like we see here in car 172. And so it's not a huge surprise that many of the cars were modified over the years. The most extreme case is car 164, seen here is the second car, which originally had 10 windows coming all the way up to the baggage door. See here, it only has 5, over 60% of the car used for freight and baggage. Car 171, which was purchased in 1919, didn't get spared the same treatment. Here we see it with 10 windows, and in the same location years later, we see it with 8. Through the last 2 windows, you can see that the dividing wall between the 2 compartments was also moved forward. Once the trolley pole hit the wire, the trolley began its way south towards Frederick. Along the way, it would stop at shelters such as this, or for anyone who was standing along the line to wave them down. But once the car reached the city, the interurbans rarely made any stops, instead continuing to the Carroll Street terminal, where Thurmont-bound trolleys would load on the east side of the building, and Hagerstown or Middletown-bound trolleys would load in Carroll Street. Passengers here would exchange interurbans to go to a different line or hop aboard the Loop line, which was the inner-city commute route. The Loop in Frederick ran a figure 8, connecting with the Fairground and Jefferson Street. Tourism was important to the company, and during the Frederick Railroad era, they adopted the Heart of Maryland route slogan and logo. This played up on the fact that the line ran near the center of the state and encouraged riders from Baltimore and D.C. who came to ride the line. In 1911, they put out a timetable that doubled as a tourism brochure for the area, including information on the business and scenic historic aspects of the city of Frederick, the scenic views visible from the area, accessible in many parts by trolley, historic sites such as Gettysburg Battlefield, and other amenities accessible from trolley or Western Maryland train. This included the Loop, the Heart of Maryland Loop being a discounted fare available through the Frederick Railroad, Hagerstown Railway, and Western Maryland Railway. This fare allowed 1 or more days to travel along all 3 companies with options to stop at picnic grounds, Penmar Park, which was owned by the Western Maryland, or Braddock Heights Park, owned by the Frederick Railroad, later the Hagerstown and Frederick. Speaking of Braddock Heights, it could be said that no community in the area was affected more than this, as there would be no Braddock Heights without the trolley. Being the first destination reached by the electric car in 1896, the farmland at the top of the mountain was purchased by executives of the trolley company, and a new company was formed to encourage construction of these large homes and hotels that could let out rooms to tourists from abroad. These tourists would ride the train to Frederick and then climb aboard the trolley, increasing fares. To further increase fares, the company built an amusement park at the top of the hill, best known for the casino building This large building was the last one standing from the amusement park. It's better known to locals as the Braddock Heights roller rink. It also had a bowling alley in the basement, but despite its name, it never had any gambling. At least not that we know of. Elsewhere in the park, there was a giant slide at the top of the hill, along with a 3-story observation tower with a spectacular view in both directions. There was an indoor carousel, a dance hall, a theater, a Ferris wheel, a miniature train ride called the Blue Mountain Railway, which at one point used steam locomotives from Penmar Park. There was a boat ride at one point, as well as a community swimming pool, which is still the Braddock Heights Community Swimming Pool. And they even had pony rides. Yes, as the sign says, real live ones. At the bottom of the hill, or the bottom of the park at least, a new station was built to replace the original shelter station by the casino building. This doubled as a store and the community post office, and today stands as the only relic of this area, Beachley's Variety Store. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go back a few decades and begin talking about the need for rail in the Middletown Valley. In the early and mid-1800s, the only way between Frederick and Hagerstown was really the Baltimore Turnpike. This, now considered part of the National Road, was constructed by contractors for the state of Maryland to connect Washington, D.C. and the city of Baltimore with the National Road, which began in Cumberland. This was Middletown's main connection to the outside world. There were other smaller county roads connecting to other communities, but this was the big one. Originally, a macadam road with multiple layers of stone to keep it very much like a paved road, maintenance declined over the years as traffic with narrow wagon wheels and heavy rains and snows deteriorated and chipped away at the pavement. By the 1870s, the companies that managed the road were in financial disarray, and counties took over control. But even so, there was very little repair, and what little amount took place wasn't helpful. And the roots of change from the Catoctin Center for Regional Studies, I read a quote here, if the roads were maintained, it was through a combination of county and private self-interested effort through the 19th and into the 20th century. Even when maintenance was undertaken, the available resources frequently offered no match for the destructive effort of weather and traffic. When you think of Alternate 40, you think of a paved road, a nice straight road. You go on into Middletown, you could visualize the road coming down Braddock Heights towards Middletown. You don't visualize an image like this, but this is that same road sometime in the late 1800s, as is this, just outside of Middletown. So you can see a bumpy, dirty road, and that was with maintenance. The top of the hill after heavy rains, you might see something a little more like this, where deep ruts cross the road and would make it difficult to travel with a horse. Even the city of Frederick wasn't spared, as you could see the rough road there in Patrick Street. It wouldn't be until 1910, when the State Roads Commission took over, that pavement began finally being laid over the hill, or over the mountain, I should say. In 1898, the Maryland Division of Highways took over, 2 years after the trolley company began, but even they had no influence. Engineers watched in dismay as supervisors' annual efforts to repair the road made no practical improvement, each season removing all traces of the previous season's work. You could just imagine how isolated this made people feel, where the only road over the mountain to Frederick of any consequence was difficult to travel, especially during bad weather when you might need to get supplies over the mountain. The portion between Frederick and Hagerstown remained the only way for the Middletown Valley to access the outside world. Farmers began to desperately throwing stones into the road to keep it from becoming too rutty. For the rest of the world, however, transportation was beginning to change things. Beginning in 1872, there was a connection from Baltimore over South Mountain to Hagerstown through Thurmont. This was the Western Maryland Railway, the new steam railroad bringing access to the people of Hagerstown. To the south, America's first railroad, the Baltimore and Ohio, connected Baltimore through Point of Rocks and Brunswick and Harper's Ferry out to Cumberland, with a branch up to Hagerstown and another line down to Washington, D.C. This company wasn't allowed to pass through Frederick, but they were allowed to send a branch just to the outskirts of town. To the east and west of the mountain range, there was the Cumberland Valley Railroad, which passed through Hagerstown, and there was the York, Hanover, and Frederick Railroad, which began around the B&O tracks along the east side of the city of Frederick, and continued up what's now East Street and out of town. These both eventually became part of the larger Pennsylvania Railroad. Farms in these areas suddenly had access to the outside world, and farmers could sell their produce to larger cities for more money. However, the people of Middletown remained isolated, with only their poorly maintained national road to get them over the mountain in either direction. In fact, it was 8 miles to the nearest railroad connection. And Middletown was on a decline. Thomas Searight, in his 1894 very contemporary history of the old pike, wrote, "Proceeding westward, we come to the village of Middletown, which hoped to become a city and might have succeeded had not the steam railway eclipsed the glory of the old pike." This lack of railroad access really took away from the availability of supplies for businesses, for access for farms to get goods and send goods, and for people to travel in general. The area probably was behind on several styles, maybe even as much as a year behind, because they weren't getting as many goods as the people in the city. So in 1893, after decades of trying to get a railroad into Middletown, a meeting took place at this school along Green Street. And 3 years later, the charter was re-ratified and new stock was sold for the Frederick and Middletown Railway. This railway was funded almost exclusively by the businessmen, farmers, and citizens of the town of Middletown. People in Frederick didn't even want it, for the most part. They were afraid that it would ruin the tree-shaded downtown area. And other cities were contacted for funding, but nobody in Philadelphia or Baltimore was really interested in investing in a little mountain climbing railroad over between Frederick and some little farm town. But nevertheless, construction began in the spring of 1896. The track was originally kind of rough, using, in some cases, second-hand rail as well as some newer rail. And farmhands, who were not needed for sowing or harvest at the time, made a little bit of extra money as construction workers on the line. Using a couple of borrowed Pennsylvania Railroad cars and some scaffolding, wire was strung above the line, and beginning in August of 1896, the first trolleys began rolling down the streets of Frederick towards Braddock Heights. It wouldn't be until October that trolleys finally reached Middletown. By that time, the people of the town were excited for the magic trolley. But it wasn't just passengers that were suddenly riding en masse over the mountain much faster than horse-drawn wagons that they had been used to. It was also freight. Catoctin Clarion in 1897 wrote that freight traffic is looming up so successfully that the Frederick and Middletown Electric Railway Company have added 2 more flat freight cars to their rolling stock. This makes 6 and 1 boxcar, aside from 3 passenger cars. Here are some examples of some later era Hagerstown and Frederick freight cars. These cars may have seen exchange service with other railroads early in their life, but for most of their service, They connected the small towns along the line and the farms with the cities themselves, allowing farmers to transport goods without needing external train cars. The growth of freight traffic on the electric road is more than fulfilling the prediction we made when we asked the public to subscribe for stock. That was also from 1897, a quote from the company's president, George William Smith. And speaking of George William Smith, here is his signature on an unused stock certificate in our society's collection. Now, a contemporary and an acquaintance of George William Smith was Folger McKenzie, who wrote part of A History of Frederick County in 1910. In his book, he wrote that as rapidly as possible after the successful inauguration of the trolley road to Braddock, the extension to Middletown was completed and proved a meritorious success. A new era dawned for the farming people of the section, for by the inauguration of a freight and express service, the road has caused to be abandoned in large measure the heavy teaming of grain, etc., that used to be necessary from the Middletown Valley and the surrounding region. Now, before I get talking about hauling grain, I should point out that it was also people that were teamed over the mountain. If you didn't have a horse or wagon of your own, or someone you could borrow or ride with, you may need to take the stage along that turnpike to get over the mountain. Just like you'd imagine with the Old West, stages passed through pretty frequently on a regular schedule, and in towns like Middletown, they could stop and exchange horses as well as stop for any passengers that needed to ride. But the trip was still bumpy, as they were still horse-drawn wagons with narrow wheels. If you did have a wagon and a horse, you might look something more like this, a simple farm wagon. These could hold maybe a ton or two, and would need 2 to 4 horses to get up over the mountain. With a light load, you might be planning on a 2-hour trip at a minimum. If the road was rough, your horses were easily tired, if you were taking a heavy load, you could be looking at 4, 6, even more hours to get over the mountain. And if your horses needed to take a rest, you at least had a stop near Braddock Heights that you could make. Near the National Pike is this spring, Braddock Spring, where General Braddock is said to have stopped and watered his horses climbing the mountain. This, by the way, was also a potential picnic stop that the trolleys would pass by and allow people to get off if they wished to. If you didn't want to mess with taking your own horse over the mountain, spending a whole day going to Frederick and back, you could hire a wagoner. These were sort of like the truck driver for hire you could get to carry your goods. A wagoner's rig could consist of a wagon with a capacity of 5 or 6 tons, and on average about 6 horses. They went at a slightly steadier pace, but it would still take them half a day to get the goods over the mountain. This changed, however, for many areas with the coming of the steam railroad. For example, if we use Smithsburg, which is about as far from Hagerstown as Middletown is from Frederick, a farmer who lived near Smithsburg would need only take his wagon load of goods to the local station. There he could have it loaded on a freight car if it was going a long distance, or if he just had a couple crates of goods, he could have it put aboard the next express car and taken into Hagerstown. If he wanted to ride along, he could do that, or he could just leave it with the express agent or the freight agent, and they would handle the shipment for him. The goods would not take 2 or 3 hours to get to Hagerstown once they were on board the train. Instead, it could take as little as half an hour to be in Hagerstown, and then climb aboard the next, if you went with the goods, climb aboard the next train heading back, and be home in another half hour. There were, of course, scheduling issues, but it still was a more convenient and quicker way to travel. So this was beginning to reshape the country as a whole. especially with the connection in the 1860s of the Atlantic to the Pacific by rail. This can be emphasized through this waybill, a record of a shipment over the Frederick and Middletown Railway. This documents that on September 25, 1899, a Kefauver ordered a delivery of 6¼ tons of fertilizer from the Ramsburg Fertilizer Company along South Street in Frederick. This fertilizer was delivered to Powerhouse by car number 18. It's likely that the Kefauver in question only needed to send a message over the mountain, and then the fertilizer would be dropped off on the siding seen in this map. Powerhouse refers to the original Frederick and Middletown Railway powerhouse near Hollow Creek and Hollow Road outside of Middletown, where there was a siding. The red line is the trolley track, and the siding was right across the creek. Across the street from the powerhouse is a private driveway leading to a farm that is now Richland Golf Club, which was owned by a Kefauver. It's likely that the farmer need only cross the street to get to his fertilizer instead of needing to take a horse wagon over the mountain 1 or 2 times to get that load of fertilizer to his farm. Continuing down the trolley line, we pass through Airview Historic District near the shopping center, which was one of America's first suburbs, built because of the presence of the trolley line, and then come to downtown Middletown, where the line skirted along Green Street, and where there was a small freight yard as well as a couple of stations that were built over the years. So you can see the line then continued out of town along Eifert Drive, and that was the continuation to Myersville. If it can be said that Middletown was isolated from the rest of the world by the lack of rail travel, it could be said even more so about Myersville, which, to get to the turnpike, the people needed to take a small country road, or to get into Washington County, and the closest direct rail line was a windy country road to Boonesboro over South Mountain, and then another country road from Boonesboro to the railroad tracks. So the people of Myersville got together and started the Myersville and Catoctin Railroad, which they constructed themselves and connected their town to the Frederick and Middletown. They leased this track to the Frederick and Middletown in exchange for a portion of the proceeds. Without going into further detail on all the different constructions, by 1904 there was a link directly from Frederick to Hagerstown, so that the people of Middletown not only could get to Frederick in half an hour, but they could get to Hagerstown in an hour and a half. And the people in Frederick could get to Hagerstown in 2 hours. This was unheard of for many people. Eventually, the company also purchased the Chambersburg, Greencastle, and Waynesboro Railway, which had a connection to Penmar Park and Blue Ridge Summit. But this line was wide gauge, and so they could never share trolleys directly. This soon bypassed the National Road as the main method of transportation between Frederick and Hagerstown. People like William Brish, who was a school teacher and pioneer of CCTV in schools, who didn't have access to transportation, could say, as he quoted, "When I was a boy, our family had no horse, carriage, or automobile, but we still had an enjoyable form of transportation that was often used. The trolley cars of the Hagerstown and Frederick Railroad provided scheduled transportation to Hagerstown, Braddock, Jefferson, Waynesboro, Chambersburg, Middletown, Myersville, and Thurmont. This also connected many of those communities with the schools in the big city, and farmers and farm children along the line suddenly had access to transportation to school before the days of bus service. Now, if a farmer, like when I said about Smithsburg, had only a couple crates, they could be loaded into the baggage compartment on the car and shipped without the farmer needing to go into town. If you had a little bit more, you could load it into an express motor that passed by. These were like self-propelled boxcars. And they also served as freight locomotives, being able to pull entire freight cars, and in this photo in Middletown, an entire freight train. This opened up the opportunity for farmers or groups of farmers to fill an entire train car and then have it shipped abroad to one of the big cities where they could get a better price for their goods. Even heads of cattle could be transported to your farm without needing to walk with them from the nearest railroad station, as we see with car number 2 and a livestock car switching in Frederick. I've even heard of calves being transported on the interurbans. And if you had goods that were best refrigerated for long-distance transport, that suddenly became an opportunity as well. Refrigerated boxcars could be leased and brought over the mountain and stopped at your nearest freight station or even at your farm if you had a siding. Best example of this is C.M. Schenck Creamery in Middletown, which in 1917 had the Hagerstown and Frederick leased them a 60,000-pound capacity refrigerator car, which they used until 1925 to regularly ship butter to Baltimore. Butter profited farmers much more than milk, as it was easier to transport and store over distances. But milk still played its part. As the Hagerstown and Frederick Railway grew, so was the dairy industry in the area, as the whole state was changing from a more grain-based farm economy to a very dairy-based economy. As dairy farms became more abundant, so did dairy associations and creameries, and the farmers needed to transport this milk so it could be distributed or processed. At the time, pasteurization was not frequently used, and the only way many farmers could cool the milk before transport was to put it in a spring house. Not quite ideal, so the milk needed transported quickly or else it would spoil. Dairy associations in various communities, like this photo from the first day of service of one such association in Frederick, offered the opportunity for farmers to conglomerate their milk product and then have a central distribution option. As you can see here, the milk was being transported in cans measuring 5, 8, or 10 gallons and was transported by horse or by truck. In fact, in 1919, the Grange recommended that the last 2 milk horse wagons be replaced with trucks. Yes, in 1919 there were still horses carrying milk. You can see one of those 2 milk carts here from the Grange file. These wagons, like many other wagons of their day, were narrow-wheeled wood wagons with a metal ring around a wooden-spoked wooden wheel, which had the possibility of breaking if it hit a rock or a rut the wrong way. And even in this 1919 photo, you can see many of the country roads still became rutty and bumpy. This increased the chance of spilling milk, as well as a broken wheel. The automobile wasn't that much better with the bumpy roads at the time, though it was a little bit improved. This isn't to say that the trolleys were a smooth or a fast run. So you could see car 48 here, running along Braddock Avenue past where the 7-Eleven on Jefferson Street now stands. It was bumping back and forth and up and down. But what the trolleys offered was a faster and a smoother ride than any horse-drawn wagon, or even at the time most automobiles could offer. And it offered convenience. The line passed through, alongside, or at least very near to many, many farms in the area. This offered the opportunity for the farmer to just leave their goods by the nearest platform, knowing the next trolley would pick it up. And then he could go about his day. Milk tags such as this could be tied to a milk can and left on the platform. The top portion would give the name of the farm so that the company would know who to return the empty can to for no cost. The bottom portion showed the size of the can so that the company knew who to bill or how much to bill. Speaking of milk, it can be said that the Hagerstown and Frederick was responsible for the growth of Maine's ice cream in Middletown. That company began in 1910, and by 1922 was producing far more ice cream than the local area could possibly consume. However, many trolley memories talk of stopping in Middletown just to go to Maine's, and it's likely that many people from Braddock Heights who were enjoying the park came down the mountain for that delicious treat on a hot summer day on a regular basis as well. And it wasn't just milk that was transported in 10-gallon milk cans. From the earliest days of rail service to the Lewistown area, fish ponds lined the tracks and dotted the countryside. Originally, many of these were goldfish breeding ponds, and the fish were, of course, transported by trolley. Or, in the earliest days, steam locomotives before the line was electrified in 1911. In 1917, the state began breeding brook trout here for stocking purposes, and in 1923 dug 5 new trout ponds, which that same year produced 29,000 baby trout. Albert Powell, in his History of the Maryland Commission of Fisheries, told how rail travel was the preferred method of transportation for these fish. Men would gather at 5 a.m. at the breeding facility, fill up to 20 10-gallon milk cans, and then measure out the fish so that they had a rough count of how many fish were in each can. The cans, along with an escort, would be loaded onto a 2-horse wagon and carried to the Lewistown trolley station just a couple miles away, where they would wait on a baggage cart for the next passing trolley. Once on the trolley, they rode to Thurmont, where another baggage cart would hold them until the next eastbound Western Maryland passenger train. They would ride in the baggage compartment to Baltimore, where they were then divvied out and would stock farm ponds and waterways across the state. Lewistown was also a frequent recipient of cargo, as many people are documented having purchased furniture from C. Carty, the furniture and undertaker, where the Civil War Medicine Museum now stands, to be delivered by trolley to their home in Lewistown. This was a common practice, making the company very much like an early FedEx or UPS service, with its delivery options, both business-related and personal. But it wasn't just goods being transported by trolley that helped the agricultural communities. It wasn't just people. It was access to the fair as well. In fact, in 1896, before the trolleys even reached Middletown, the Frederick of Middletown built a branch from downtown Frederick to the fairgrounds. That first year of service, the company saw 15,000 riders to the fair alone. And the fairgrounds also hosted many other functions. The 1897 Catoctin Clarion also records that there was a picnic hosted at the fairgrounds that year, celebrating the Emancipation Proclamation. And that day alone, one single trolley car running to the fairgrounds and back amassed almost 2,800 fares. For this service, there was a siding out front of the entrance of the fairgrounds so that trolleys could load and unload while other loop trolleys passed by in both directions. The Hagerstown Agricultural Fair had the very similar treatment, with a trolley line outside of its fairground, also along the Hagerstown City Loop, and for a time another siding that allowed the trolley to pull off and load and unload while the loop trolleys passed by. In 1923, the loop recorded $5,000 in fares during fair month. This is compared to the next highest month being only $2,800. That year, the company saw its highest ridership on record. 3.8 million riders rode the Hagerstown and Frederick in 1923, more than both of Baltimore's streetcar companies combined for that year. But it wasn't to last. It was said by 1920 that every point of consequence along the Hagerstown and Frederick was already reached by paved road. More and more families were buying automobiles. More businesses had trucks. And even the Hagerstown and Frederick, or the company that it was to become, was beginning bus services. Sections of the route began being abandoned, and buses began replacing the trolleys along the roads at slightly higher speeds with more stops. And these buses including the company's own Blue Ridge Bus Company that eventually was sold to Greyhound, shared the trolley's maintenance facilities, as we saw there with the Hagerstown car barn and a bus inside the car barn. In 1938, the line over South Mountain between Myersville and Hagerstown was finally severed, so that the state could construct the new Route 40. When World War II came, passenger ridership went up a little bit, but freight service increased dramatically. 2 steeple cab locomotives were purchased secondhand, as well as multiple express motors, such as number 9 here, and the much larger number 1 that you'll see in just a moment. These cars frequented the Thurmont line, though they occasionally went over the mountain to Middletown. But between Frederick and Thurmont, they were often seen hauling loads of scrap. The Western Maryland would bring freight cars loaded with tanks and planes from the war front from the ships in Baltimore, where the trolleys would continue the run to Jefferson Street, where the Army had a scrap yard, where the metal would be cut up, sorted, and then sent back out by trolley to be melted down for the war effort. But in 1947, the Hagerstown line, the last line in Washington County, was closed. 1948, the Middletown route over the mountain was closed. In 1954, all that remained was the Thurmont branch, and passenger service ended on that cold, rainy February 20th, 1954, with that last round trip. A year later, the freight motors were all retired, and the electric lines came back down, being replaced by 2 diesel locomotives such as this. But even they did not last, and in 1961, all railroad assets were sold off. This was not, however, the end of the company. From the earliest days of service, the trolleys had run off of 550 to 600 volts DC power. But being that DC power decays over long distances, the company needed to generate AC power and convert it at substations every couple of miles. This left them with an excess of electricity, which they could then sell to people along the line. As this business grew, they began buying other companies and other trolley lines and developing an early power grid. By 1923, that 3.8 million riders, they still made over 60% of their income selling electricity rather than running trains. So after purchasing a company in Cumberland that had recently changed its name, they decided that that name suited the company best and decided to use it for themselves. That is how the Hagerstown and Frederick Railway became the Potomac Edison Company. Having provided electricity to the rural areas along the line and developed a grid through the rural countryside and connecting smaller towns along the way, the trolley had opened up the opportunity for farmers, residents, and businesses to replace steam-powered and hand-cranked tools and devices with electronic counterparts. They offered the opportunity for electric lighting to allow business and farming work to begin earlier in the day or continue later at night without the risk of dim candle or lamplight. These amenities for many rural areas across the country were still lacking as late as the 1930s and 1940s, taking farms into the future. So if you ever see some poles or a berm or hill that don't seem quite like they fit, keep in mind that you might be looking at the company that helped bring Frederick and Washington County further into the future, ahead of other similar rural areas. You may very well be looking at the Hagerstown and Frederick Railway. Thank you.